Welcome back to a new episode of Podcast on the Brink. Recording this on Wednesday night, March 8th. Indiana set to tip off Big Ten tournament play on Friday night. The opponent obviously not known at this point. Could play Maryland, could play Nebraska, could play Minnesota. Still up in the air. Indiana won't know until late Thursday night who they're going to play. On this week's episode of Podcast on the Brink, happy to be joined by an old friend, Justin Albers. I believe Justin was the second student that we had right for Inside the Hall. Started with us all the way back in 2011, 2011-12, 2012-13 seasons. He worked with us, hasn't been in the business now for several years, but we've brought him back into the fray for the stretch run of this IU season with Ryan Carrazza currently out on maternity leave. Justin has been writing the minute after. Justin, welcome back to Podcast on the Brink. Good to talk to you.
Yeah, thanks, Alex. It's great to be back and go back to the roots. Yeah, I mean, you guys really gave me my opportunity and start way back in the day, and the career has taken me in a different direction, but it's not taken me, completely away from paying attention to IU hoops. So when you and I talked about Ryan and the opportunity to come back for a short period, it was definitely enticing, and it's been a real pleasure to do it, over the last month or so.
So what, just in the big picture, watching, you're obviously not at games. I think you actually went to a game this season. Correct me if I'm wrong, at Assembly Hall, but you obviously watch the games. You've been watching them maybe a little more closely these past couple weeks. What have just been your overall impressions of this IU basketball season? Really thinking back to when we first started covering the team for Inside the Hall, 2007, 2008 season, I believe was our first season. And there's not been a long history, obviously, of success for IU basketball, and this is one of the better years over that time period in general. But Justin, just kind of your thoughts on this season, how the Hoosiers are playing, and kind of how they're set up right now, headed into postseason play.
Yeah, I mean, you and I got to cover, two of maybe the better seasons over the last 20 years together with the Tom Crean, Oladipo, Zeller teams, the preseason number one team, the team that was a number one seed in the tournament, two back-to-back Sweet 16 runs. I mean, I'll be quite honest with you, during the Archie Miller years, I kind of faded away from the program in terms of, it was just hard for me to watch. And when they brought Woodson back, I've been tuned in, intently to every game. This season, like you said, it's been one of the better ones over the last decade for sure. The ability to bring Trayce Jackson-Davis back for another year was obviously a big get, and Race Thompson for his sixth year. But, for the first time I can remember in recent memory, bringing in a freshman class where somebody, at least one of the freshmen, contribute in a major way. And Jalen Hood-Schifino, Malik Renew has had his moments for sure, and Caleb Banks has played more of late. But I think that's been really unique to see the combination of, the extreme veteran side with Jackson-Davis and Race Thompson, and then you have the real youngsters and Jalen Hood-Schifino, even though they may leave Indiana at the same time. That kind of combination has been interesting. I've seen the team really grow up this year. I remember back in the Xavier game in the non-conference season, thinking immediately after that game, that's not a game Indiana wins in the past 3, 4, 5 years. They had it, and then they fell behind, and just the grit to grind it out stuck with me. And during the Big Ten season, we've seen that time and time again with this Indiana team, even when, they're not playing the prettiest of basketball, shots aren't falling, the bench isn't contributing, they found ways to win games against what has really been a highly competitive Big Ten this year. You can debate back and forth whether it's a bunch of average teams that will dissipate very quickly in the postseason, or if it's a bunch of very competitive teams just beating each other up, or some combination thereof. But regardless, a lot of these games Indiana has won this year are games they would not have won in the past, and it just, to me, is a sign of a mentally strong team, a resilient team. The margin of error is obviously slim, but they've always been fun to watch in the same way that they were fun to watch last year in Woodson's first year. As the year went on, they got better. Obviously, beat a really good Illinois team in the Big Ten tournament, won a play-in game in the NCAAs before losing to St. Mary's. I think they kind of built on that, and their persona is one that I think Indiana fans can get behind, of a defensive first team, resilient, and the way that they've won games is just kind of different for me. So heading into this Big Ten tournament, as a 3 seed, they could have been anywhere from 2 to 8 heading into that last game. I like their chances in this tournament, which you don't often say about an Indiana team heading into a Big Ten tournament.
I'm curious, just from somebody who covered the team for as long as you did. You obviously covered mostly the Tom Crean era, and then you mentioned kind of, you're an IU grad, so you obviously still wanted to follow the program, but kind of dipping out there a little bit during the Archie Miller years, and then coming back in, as basically as just an observer to watch the last couple of years of Mike Woodson. What was it about the Woodson hire that piqued your interest in terms of getting back engaged with the program?
It was interesting because when his name was floated as a potential candidate at the time, I didn't love it. And then I became more in love with it as the process went on, because I saw that a long-standing issue in the Indiana fan base may be resolved. The old fan base in the Bob Knight era and the newer fan base, I feel like, had been divided for a long time, and that wasn't going to reconcile itself. Certainly Tom Crean was not going to change that, and Archie Miller was not going to change that. But Mike Woodson, having played for Knight, having succeeded under Knight, coming back and coaching a modern team with his NBA experience, really bridged that gap. And it was interesting to me, too, from the standpoint, it's kind of been a trend hiring former players, hiring, guys that have been involved in the NBA in college. But his experience at that level should be attractive, and I think has been attractive to players, that, hey, I've seen what it takes to succeed on this level. You're not there yet. And kind of that brutal honesty that, I know he's had with Trayce Jackson-Davis, and I'm sure with many other players, is something that I think young kids need and probably want. But in an era where kids transfer all the time and, maybe don't want to be patient and sit behind a guy for a year, he's kind of, somewhere in between, kind of like the Deion Sanders on the football side, where he's going to be brutally honest with you. And in most scenarios, the players have liked what they've heard because they know he knows what he's talking about and he can help them get to the next level. So, that's good from a player development standpoint. But from a university standpoint, it's great to bring back a former player that has that kind of experience. And, I think really the biggest thing was bridging the gap in the fan base and bringing, two sides together that had no reason really to be divided. It's a great Indiana fan base, and Woodson's ability to connect those two sides, I think, really turned it for me.
One thing I've been thinking about lately is just Trayce Jackson-Davis and the career that he's put together at Indiana. Obviously, in our time on the beat, we've covered some really good players: Cody Zeller, Victor Oladipo. I mean, Eric Gordon was the first year we did Inside the Hall. Obviously, we weren't going to games at that point, but still writing about the team. He's a guy that a lot of people remember. Yogi Ferrell is another one. Just from a historical context, really in the last 15, 20 years, Trayce Jackson-Davis is no doubt one of the better players to put on an Indiana uniform. The one thing that really has been elusive in his career, and he has a chance to change that, is winning in the postseason, or putting some type of banner, whether that be a Big Ten tournament banner, which Indiana's never won the Big Ten tournament, or making a tournament run, having a chance to go to a Final Four and play for a national championship. That would obviously cement him or cement his legacy at IU. But he's already going to be remembered as a great player. How do you think Trayce Jackson-Davis should be viewed by the fan base in terms of great players to ever put on the uniform? Obviously, he's ranked highly on the scoring list, and he's the program's all-time leading rebounder, the all-time leading shot blocker. He's always been a model citizen on and off the floor. Every time that I've ever talked to him, it's just been really a pleasure to interact with him, and he just seems like such a great kid. I'm just kind of curious from your perspective, and you've obviously covered some of the same players that I have on your time on the beat. Where does Trayce stack up for you? Maybe not to rank him, but I'm just kind of curious where he should, how his legacy should be remembered by IU fans.
Yeah, I think you hit it on the head. I think number one, he represents Indiana in the best way possible, which is really all you can ask out of your star player. And, the culture piece of that, having a really good kid in a position where he's the best player on the team at a university where basketball matters is really important, because we've seen that during our time kind of go sideways when that hasn't been instilled or in place. The transition from the Holes, Oladipo, Sheehy era into the start of the Yogi, Hana Perea, those type of guys era, there was some drop off, and I think most of that was culture related. So, number one, he's a great human being, but I think he should rank highly, because he represents what I think college basketball should be about. A guy that could have gone to the NBA, and probably a lot of guys in his position would have entered their name to the draft, whether he was going to be a first round or second round pick, probably a second round pick. A lot of guys still enter the draft nowadays. He chose to come back not once but twice, and I think that's something that has been lost in college basketball. From a player standpoint, he's really interesting in the fact that he's done everything that he's done without really ever adding anything offensively to his game that's outside of the paint. People debate this all the time about should he have added a mid-range jumper or stepped out and shot. And I think probably, given our experience knowing Tom Crean, if Crean would have been the coach now, Jackson-Davis is probably shooting threes at least a couple of games. That's just the style he was. But Trayce has found a way to impact college basketball at the highest level without really leaving the paint, which is really, when you think about it, remarkable. And I know there's a debate amongst IU fans about whether, the player development is what it should be at IU, and whether Trayce has developed as a player in the way that, maybe Victor did when he was at IU. And I think, it may not be as clear, but, for example, the ability for Trayce, he can take a rebound and lead a fast break. He's a great passer without ever outletting the ball. That's not something he had in his game last year or the year before, and that's an NBA skill. You look at guys, not to compare him, but like Nikola Jokic and the way the game is played in the NBA now, a big guy that can grab the ball and go is so valuable in basketball, and he's added that to his game. So while he may not have added a jump shot or things of that nature. He's certainly improved his free throw shooting. He can do that in terms of running the break and with his passing. But, his defense cannot be denied. His shot blocking, the way he impacts a team, and then just the person he is as a leader. I think those culture things are more important than maybe people think about. And having a guy there for that long, that's your best player and that good of a person, really matters. So I'd put him, you said not to rank him, so I won't, but I'd put him, high up there on the list from the guys I've seen over the last decade.
When you look at this Indiana team for the postseason and what's coming up, obviously the cliche thing that everybody will say is it's all about matchups, and it's true because a lot of it's going to depend on the draw. Even in the Big Ten tournament, there's certain teams that Indiana is going to be better equipped to face in the Big Ten tournament, and the same thing will be the case when the NCAA tournament bracket comes out this weekend. Obviously, a lot of excitement amongst the fan base to see how the weekend goes with the Big Ten tournament and to see who Indiana is going to play in the NCAA tournament. What type of team in the tournament do you feel like is maybe the type of team that Indiana least wants to see? If you need a second to think about this, I'll just kind of give you my big picture thought on it. A team that shoots the ball well from the perimeter, I feel like is a potential issue for Indiana, just based on the fact that they don't take a large volume of threes. And I know a lot of that's by design. They're a better 3-point shooting team this season from a percentage perspective, but they're still not a high volume 3-point shooting team. And if you have a team that that you face, say like a Penn State in the Big Ten tournament, that's a team that Indiana could potentially play. Penn State's going to take a ton of threes. In the NCAA tournament, it's the same thing. You could have a team that can come out and make 10 or 12 threes. I think that's potentially a problem for Indiana. What, from just a matchup standpoint, do you think are the biggest things that Indiana would want to avoid from an opponent when the draw comes out?
Yeah, I think that's certainly true, but I'd even go bigger picture and just say a really good offensive team. I think Indiana, if you look at their schedule, you see a lot of teams in the Big Ten this year that I think really struggle to score down the stretch. You look at Rutgers, Northwestern, Michigan, Maryland, all these teams, they're not great offensively. The team really in the Big Ten that is good offensively, you mentioned Penn State, who beat IU, but also Iowa, would probably be the class of the Big Ten in terms of offensive and scoring, and IU struggled against them both times. Arizona, a team in the non-conference that I think can really score it, gave them problems as well. So that's really where I think they could run into problems, because I think their defense is strong enough that if they're locked in and really, connected and playing like we've seen them for the most part play over the last 6 to 8 weeks, they can be in a game and potentially win it late. They've proven that time and time again. But I don't think they're a great offensive team, and they have limited weapons when it comes to offense. So a team that can really score it, that will run away from them or not allow them to stick around, I think will give them a lot of problems. That's kind of broad in terms of offensive teams, but the Big Ten has been a league that's really a grinded out league this year in particular, and Indiana's won a lot of those games. But when they've played teams that can really score, especially late in games, they've struggled. So that would be my pick, and I think that kind of matches up fairly well when you look at the top teams in the NCAA tournament. They're not necessarily high octane offenses. Kansas can score, IU's seeing them, but their defense is probably stronger. Alabama would really give them problems, I think, but Houston is really a defensive team that could be a grinded out game. So I think teams like Iowa, teams that can really score it, and have some kind of balance on defense, a little more than Iowa, would be teams IU does not want to see on their side of the bracket.
You mentioned the limited options offensively. And I think that's one of the things you look at this Indiana team. Obviously, they've got pros and Trayce Jackson-Davis and Jalen Hood-Schifino. But then you look down the roster and, you got Miller Kopp, you got Trey Galloway, you got Race Thompson. These are all guys that are capable on a given night of giving you 10 to 15 points, but it's not a consistent thing. And then I think the other thing, when you look down the roster even further at the bench, it's been something that I've been writing about a lot, been mentioning a lot in 5 takeaways, been tweeting about it. Just the lack of consistency in the development of the bench, I think, has put even more pressure on guys like Trayce Jackson-Davis and Jalen Hood-Schifino to show up every night and have big games. How concerned are you about Indiana's lack of production from its bench entering the tournament? And is this a situation now where the production that Indiana is getting from that part of its team is what it is, and Mike Woodson's just going to have to ride his top players as much as possible and hope for the best when tournament play gets here?
Very concerned, and I think that's absolutely the case. Who are you going to trust if it's a 5-point game, 3 minutes left in a tournament game? Is he going to run out Geronimo or Tamar Bates or Caleb Banks? He's not. And I think if they can just get one of those guys off the bench that Woodson's comfortable enough to put in there, even, for a 6 or 7 minute run in the first half or early in the second half, that would be a huge win. If Tamar Bates is making shots, if Geronimo, who really I thought played well during the time that Race Thompson was out with his knee injury, but has obviously struggled with his own injuries and been out lately. He brings a lot of energy. So if you can just get one of those guys on a given night, I think you'll be okay in a setting where, unlike the regular season, you might play 2 games in a weekend and then have 4 days off. I think the bench can be overblown. I think where it becomes an issue is with Xavier Johnson being out for the year, you really only have 2 real ball handlers in Trey Galloway and Hood-Schifino. And unfortunately, those guys have gotten into a habit of picking up fouls early in the game. The way Galloway plays as a defensive stalwart and, really aggressive, he's going to get into foul trouble. Hood-Schifino really has got to stay out of foul trouble going forward. He's gotten into this habit of picking up a cheap foul in the first half that get him 2, and then he goes to the bench. And if they don't have those 2 guys, like, who would you say is their third primary ball handler if they had to pick one after those 2 guys? It's probably Trayce.
Right. They don't have one.
So, I think that's a big issue because everybody talks about the tournament and the postseason being a lot about guard play. And Indiana's guards, Galloway and Kopp have been really good. But ball handling wise, you have, IU has been susceptible to, half court, full court pressure all year. And if you don't have those guys in there to break it, things could turn on them in a real way, even with how much Trayce Jackson-Davis brings to the game. So that's probably my biggest concern is one or both of those guys getting into foul trouble like they did against Michigan, but even worse. And, scoring wise, you mentioned, there's not a lot of depth there in terms of scoring. It's really been on Trayce and Jalen for most of the season, and Kopp and Galloway for the stretch run have really had to play really well and make their open shots just to get them to a 1 or 2 point win. And they'll have to continue to do that, but they have to find a 5th guy. Race was that guy the other night, played really well against Michigan, but Tamar Bates, it's hard to believe he's going to suddenly find the scoring range given what he's done over his last 15 games. But you need somebody else, and I don't know who that's going to be. But I think if they could just get one more guy, that would go a long way in helping them, make a potential Sweet 16 run.
Yeah, I mean, they need Bates to do something like he did against Michigan, right? I mean, he didn't necessarily shoot the ball well from a percentage standpoint, but he came in and made 2 threes. That's the kind of thing that you need to maybe just push you over the top, because these tournament games, I'm not as worried about the fatigue factor because there's adrenaline when you get to the tournament, and there's also a ton of TV timeouts that are a little bit longer because you get into the NCAA tournament and the commercial breaks are a little bit longer. These guys are going to have plenty of chance throughout the game to get a little bit of a break. I mean, Trayce has been logging crazy minutes all season long. He's not coming off the floor unless he absolutely has to. Same thing with the other guys. I agree with your point too on the foul trouble. You just have to stay solid and not pick up silly fouls. Like Malik Renew, one reason he's been unable to play in so many games is he'll commit a foul 94 feet away from the basket, off of the guy's clearly got the rebound. He just needs to run back on defense instead he's reaching and trying to poke the ball loose. That's the kind of stuff that you really just can't have from your bench, and that's something that needs to be cleaned up, obviously, going forward. In terms of the debate, which I guess there really wasn't a debate because Zach Edey won pretty convincingly in terms of Big Ten Player of the Year. Where did you come down on the Edey versus Jackson-Davis conversation for Big Ten Player of the Year? I didn't have a vote, but I probably would have given it to Edey just by a hair, based on the fact that Purdue won the Big Ten outright by 3 games. I know a lot of people like to cite the head-to-head matchups this season, Indiana beating them twice, but you also have to factor in the fact that he was the best player on the team that also won the Big Ten by 3 games.
Yeah, just real quick before I answer that question, I think to your last point, somebody just has to make shots for Indiana. It can be Kopp, it can be Galloway, it could be Bates. Somebody has to make shots to open up the lane. Nobody was making shots early against Michigan, and that really crowded Trayce and Race inside. Once Kopp, found the range and Bates made a couple of threes, then you had the high-low action that was, 2-on-2 where IU really thrives. So I don't know that it matters who it is. You play hard defense like Bates and Kopp did on Sunday, and then somebody has to make shots to spread the floor. On Edey Jackson-Davis, I think you had to give it to Edey for his body of work, non-conference on. I think if it was Big Ten play only, you probably have really close to a 50-50 split with Jackson-Davis, and probably I would have given it to him just with Big Ten play. But given who Purdue beat in the non-conference, how Edey played in those games, I think you had to give it to him. But I think I saw on Twitter you posted that in any normal year, Jackson-Davis wins this award, and I think that's true. What he did this year, especially down the stretch run, how many minutes he played was just incredible. Something we've not seen from an Indiana player in a while, but I do think Edey deserved it. And that kind of brings us into the Coach of the Year debate, which I'll turn things around and ask you a question, because I know your tweet about Chris Collins from Northwestern winning Coach of the Year got quite a bit of play on Twitter. What were your thoughts on that, and who do you think should have won?
Well, obviously, I think Matt Painter should have won, and that's not to take anything away. This is not a bash Chris Collins, opinion, or Chris Collins didn't do a great job. I think the fact that Northwestern has not been good now this is the first time they've been good in 6 seasons, had a lot to do with the fact, with the reasoning why they were picked so low in the league. I mean, where else would Northwestern have been picked in the preseason based on their recent history? So just because they outperformed their preseason ranking, to me, doesn't justify picking him over a coach whose team was picked 5th to win the league, but won the league outright by 3 games. Also lost Travion Williams, Jaden Ivey, and Sasha Stefanovic off last year's team. And you can say that he had the player of the year on his team, but look at what Zach Edey was as a player when he came to Purdue, and look at the player he is now. I think Matt Painter has to have played somewhat of a role in that development of him as a player. So, I think Chris Collins obviously should be commended for the job that he did. He really turned Northwestern around this season. I think they're a great story. I think most big, when you get to the tournament and the NCAA tournament, Big Ten programs root for each other, and people will be hoping that Northwestern can get in there and have a chance to win a couple of games in advance. But if we're talking about the coach who did the best job, I think you have to give it to the guy whose team won the league outright by 3 games, and also had the player of the year on his team that he had a big hand in developing.
Yeah, I mean, for the record, I agree with you. I think absolutely it's Painter. I think he was probably hurt by the fact that they immediately kind of rose to the national scene in that, early season tournament. So it felt like, probably to the casual voter that they were a top 10, top 5 team all year long, when really, that wasn't the case in the offseason. They're bringing in these freshman guards. They're shuffling things around, losing people. So I think the fact that probably to some people that voted, it felt like they were number one the whole year and just stayed there, and it didn't warrant it. But Painter, I think is one of the best coaches in the year in the country, and certainly, deserved this award this year. But Chris Collins has done a good job. If he deserved Coach of the Year, I would just say I think his team should have better than 5th place odds in Vegas to win the Big Ten tournament championship. Just saying.
Yeah, speaking of the Big Ten tournament, what if the first game's going on right now as we record this? Ohio State and Wisconsin are playing, really a game that Wisconsin can't afford to lose. But there's obviously some bubble implications this tournament. I mean, you got Penn State, you've got Rutgers, you got Michigan, you got Wisconsin, all teams that have tournament aspirations. So I think of the major conference tournaments from a bubble perspective, this is, the league that has kind of the most riding on this event. What are you looking for? It's kind of weird. Indiana is going to play the 9th game in the Big Ten tournament. There's going to be obviously 2 games tonight, 4 on Thursday, and then they'll play 3 more on Friday before Indiana actually tips off. So a lot of the teams will already be out of there by the time Indiana tips off. What's most intriguing to you about this whole weekend? What teams do you like to advance? And just from an IU perspective, is there a real chance that this team goes to Sunday and actually wins the thing?
Yeah, I think just, the competitiveness of all these games is intriguing, because who would have thought Ohio State, Wisconsin is a Wednesday night 13-12 matchup? That is kind of crazy when you think about it. And I think the Rutgers Michigan game is really intriguing. A lot of people see that as kind of a winner go home type game. Certainly for Michigan, I think some people have Rutgers still in the field, but Michigan I haven't seen in as many brackets, but I do think they're a better team. I really have no idea who's going to win the championship, and that's intriguing to me as well. The fact that it's so wide open. Purdue is clearly the best team and has been all year long, but Michigan State's played really well. I really like Michigan State going into March, whether it's in this tournament or beyond it. They've really gotten better guard play, and Izzo really has them going in March like he always does. From an Indiana standpoint, I think if there was a year for them to get to the title and win it, I think they've only been to one Big Ten tournament championship game in the tournament's history and lost it. This would be the year, because things lined up really well for them. They would play either the last place team in the league in Minnesota, Nebraska, who they already beat by 20 plus points, or Maryland, who they lost to, but really, really struggles when they're not at home. And the odds kind of bear that out. When you look at the Vegas odds, there's, I think IU has 2 times of better shot to win the tournament odds wise than Maryland does. So this would be the year. They would have to go through probably Maryland and probably Northwestern, but you couldn't rule out, I really like Penn State as a sleeper in this tournament and beyond, because like you said earlier, they have the shooting, they have the star power, they can isolate, and they can really get hot. So I think, as a 10 seed in the Big Ten tournament, I think a lot of people have them in to March regardless, but, certainly they'd like to win that game against Illinois. It's going to be interesting. And I wouldn't pick Indiana to win the tournament just because I've watched the Big Ten tournament for a lot of years and I've never seen them win the Big Ten tournament. But if there was a year, this would be it.
Justin, it's been great to have you back writing for Inside the Hall. Thanks for being willing to step in here while Ryan's out. We really appreciate it. Also, good to have you back on the podcast. Hope you enjoyed coming back and talking some IU hoops this week.
Absolutely, man. Thanks for having me. Before we go, I got to get your pick for the Big Ten tournament. You can't hold me to it and not pick one your own.
Yeah, I mean, in the preview that I wrote, I said Purdue had the best path, and a lot of people like Michigan State coming into this tournament. I just don't see. I looked at the bracket, and the teams that gave Purdue the most trouble in the regular season of the Big Ten are all mostly in the bottom half of the bracket. That's Indiana's side of the bracket. So I see a potential problem for Purdue on Friday against Michigan because I think Michigan's going to be super motivated to get a win that can push them into the field. But if they can get past that game, I like them to beat either probably Iowa or Michigan State. If they both get that far, I think those are 2 teams that Purdue matches up pretty well against. So I'll go with the chalk pick, and Purdue to me has the best chance to do it. And I think they're going to be motivated from the standpoint of a lot of the brackets now kind of have them as the final number 1 seed, or maybe even on the 2 line. If they can get to Sunday and win, maybe they reestablish themselves, particularly with UCLA's injury news and maybe some other teams falling in their conference tournaments. These games could actually mean something for Purdue to get that number 1 seed. So I'll go with Purdue.
I mean, even Rutgers could beat them. They've had a lot of success against Purdue this year and in the past. So that 8-9 is kind of a tough draw for them. But
we saw it last year that the number 1 seed went down on Friday as Indiana beat Illinois. So anything can happen. But the flip side of that also is, Indiana could potentially have to go through, Maryland, which we've already seen Maryland beat Indiana. Penn State, we've already seen beat Indiana, and Illinois. Indiana's already beat them twice. I know that a lot of people say it's hard to beat a team 3 times. I don't know if that's actually true based on the statistics, but I know Illinois has a lot of talent. So it's not going to be an easy path for any of these teams. And we're also, I also forgot to even mention Northwestern because they're down there too with Indiana. They've already beat Indiana twice. So it's not going to be easy for anybody to get there. Whoever gets to Sunday is going to have earned it. And in a lot of ways, I don't know how important it is to actually win the conference tournament, because I know Iowa, I believe, won it last year and then came out and lost, I believe, in the first game of the NCAA tournament. So, for if you're already a lock to make the tournament, maybe it's better to go home and get the extra rest. I have no idea what ultimately matters the most. I think like once the big bracket comes out, it's just, to me, about how the styles of play kind of match up. And I think early on, there's not going to be many teams that match up well with Trayce Jackson-Davis, but obviously anything can happen. Indiana's probably going to be in that like 3, 4, 5 seed range, and that's where upsets do happen at times. So it's going to be a lot of fun to follow for sure.
I know we have to go, but that's really why this tournament matters for IU. I think is that 4 or 5 seeding area is difficult just in the teams that you'd have to play in the second and third rounds. If they could win one or two games and try and get to that 3 line. I think that makes a big difference. I don't see them falling out of the 4 or 5 range. Last question for you before you go. Do you see this? Because almost every bracket outside of Purdue and Indiana, who are top 4 seeds, a lot of teams projected to make it, but not higher really than a 7 seed. Do you see this as a year where the Big Ten makes noise, or do you see this as a year where a lot of these teams, are fairly average, they beat up on each other, and they bounce out fairly early?
I mean, it's hard to say because I don't really love any of the teams that are going to be that are seeded. I mean, Northwestern's obviously a great story, but do I trust them when the bracket comes out to actually advance? A lot of it's obviously going to depend on who they play, but I wouldn't project them to make a deep run. I mean, Rutgers at this point, we don't even know if they're going to make it, and the wheels have really fallen off there. Michigan State, I think, has a chance to advance, but the one thing about them that I don't necessarily love is they don't seem to have like a star player that can just take over. I mean, they've got good players like Tyson Walker, AJ Hogard, Malik Hall, Hauser. Those are all solid players, but they're not stars. And when you get into a tournament situation, you kind of need a go-to guy. And I don't know if Michigan State has that. I think Iowa, do you trust Farron McCaffrey when the tournament actually starts? He had Keegan Murray on his team last year, won the Big Ten tournament, and then lost in the opening game, I believe, of the NCAA tournament. Hard to trust Iowa. The one team I will say, if they can get in, that I do think has a chance to do damage is Michigan. They did it last year where they had that late surge and got in and went to the Sweet 16 with Hunter Dickinson and Kobe Buffkin and Jed Howard. They've got some guys that can do some things, and they've played really well here down the stretch. I mean, they could have won either game last week. At Illinois, they go to double overtime, and at Indiana, they went to overtime, ultimately lose that game. So if they can come out and get a win against Rutgers and maybe beat Purdue and get in the field, they're a team that I would definitely not want to play.
Yeah, 2 lottery picks on that team. I think my choice would be either Michigan team. I really have a feeling Michigan State is a second weekend team. For whatever reason, I really like Hogart. I really like the team that Izzo's put together here. They don't have a star like you said, but I feel like they're fairly well balanced, and they've hit their stride here late in the year. But no, we got to go. So I just want to say, everybody listening to this podcast already knows, but Inside the Hall is an institution, and it's been a real pleasure to come back and reconnect with you and with the audience again. So thanks for the opportunity.
Absolutely. It's been awesome to have you back, Justin, and it's obviously not over. You're still doing the minute after. So hopefully there's many more pieces to come from that the rest of the season. As for Podcast on the Brink, we'll be back next week at some point with another episode, depending on, I guess we'll see what happens with the bracket reveal on Sunday, where Indiana's going to go, and who they're going to play, when the game's going to be. We'll have some type of episode next week, hard to tell you when exactly that's going to be. If you enjoy the show, please leave us a rating or review on Apple Podcasts. Leave us a rating on Spotify, and we'll be back soon with another episode of Podcast on the Brink.